Welcome to the Duncan Halsey Hotel and to our annual review and budget breakfast event. Always nice to see so many familiar faces and friends of the firm are with us this morning. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast as much as I did. The condemned man ate a hearty breakfast, or so the saying goes. But who is the condemned man? Is it David Cameron or Ed Miliband? Or is it George Osborne or Ed Balls? Now, hopefully we'll find some clues this morning before the general election next year. Now, my favourite anecdote from this year's budget coverage was on Radio 5, who were hosting their immediate post-budget analysis from a ladies' hairdresser's in Peterborough. And the presenter firstly insulted a lady by asking her if she'd had her hair done. And then he asked her what she thought about the budget. I wasn't really concentrating on that, she said. Me and my friend were discussing which of the Chancellors we fancied. First blood to George Osborne, then, you would have thought. No, we've never fancied any of them, she replied. So the problems of life in high office, not good for the worry lines. Interestingly, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the only one of the four great offices of state never to have been held by a lady in nearly 800 years. In his fifth budget, Mr. Osborne focused on economic gains and falling unemployment, but his key message was the need for more austerity. The most telling statistic to me is always the annual borrowing requirement, and this year it's down to £100 billion, which means that the total government spend on schools, hospitals, pensions, constructions and the like is still £100 billion more than the annual tax take. And to me, that statistic always puts everything else into context, together, of course, with an impending general election next year. With relatively little to play with, Chancellors will always look for the double whammy, remember John Major, of vote-catching economic reforms. Now, we opened by saying that the economy is continuing to recover and is recovering faster than forecast. That borrowing deficit had been as high as £180 billion, but is forecast to be gradually eliminated with a small surplus by 2018-19. And then the Chancellor or Chancelloress of the day will have something to give away. Now, in 2013, we grew by 1.8%, which was 3 times more than predicted by the Office for Budget Responsibility this time last year. Economic growth this year is expected to be as high as 2.7%, which will make the UK economy one of the fastest growing advanced economies in the world. The Chancellor, clearly delighted with this, advised that they had set out their plans and together with the British people, which is us, had held their nerve. However, the job is far from done, he said. We still don't invest, export or save enough, and he announced measures to put that right. He encourages businesses to export more, build more and manufacture more. To achieve this, there's a £7 billion package to cut energy bills for manufacturers and other businesses, and a very welcome doubling of the annual investment allowance, about which more later. Incentives for house building came in the form of £500 million of finance for small house builders, as well as expanding the Help to Buy scheme for the rest of the decade. There are also changes to the export finance system, including a doubling of funding available and a 1/3 reduction in interest rates charged. I was pleased to see extended grants to take on apprentices and the introduction of degree-level apprenticeships. I feel strongly that for decades, having sent more and more of our young people to university, the government has then seemingly abandoned them when they graduate with limited job opportunities available. We still have more than 900,000 16 to 24-year-olds who are out of work. However, on the whole, employment grew by 104,000 in the first quarter of 2014, interestingly driven by a surge in self-employment, which must be good news for accountants. And the unemployment rate is now down to 7.2%, albeit that's still far too high. Now, the main rate of corporation tax reduces from 23% to 21%, and then to 20% next year, which is, of course, a major political triumph. as it means that the main rate and small companies rate of 20% will at last be one and the same. Now, the government should be praised for that, as the main rate was as high as 52% between 1973 and 1982, and 30% as recently as 2007. Although I don't like this relatively recent phenomenon of announcing attractive measures, but then they're not available until next year. If they want the political gain, the government should really be prepared to take some of the economic pain. Now, the budget's been praised by manufacturers. The chief executive of the manufacturers' organisation, EEF, commented that the Chancellor said this will be a budget for manufacturers, and he's delivered on his word. The government clearly recognises the need to make the competitiveness of the UK a priority. We argued strongly for the need to reduce the rising costs of energy faced by many companies, and he's acted on that. And taken together with measures to boost investment, exports and skills, the Chancellor deserves a pat on the back. We've always said that to achieve a resilient economy, government must back manufacturing, and we've seen that from this budget. Now, Clive Drinkwater, the Regional Director of UKTI, was similarly praiseworthy. And John Cridland, the Director General of the CBI, commented that the budget will put wind into the sails of business investment, especially for manufacturers. The personal allowance increased to £10,000, another landmark figure, and to £10,500 from next year. There are far-reaching reforms for pensions, more on that later, and changes for savers, with cash and share ISAs being merged into one pot that can hold £15,000. Good news for drinkers, with a freeze on duty for spirits and a reduction in beer duty. I was delighted to see the introduction of a pensioners' bond that will pay higher interest rates than the norm for older people for whom saving rates are a real problem. During the banking crisis, when doing my dad's tax return, I was horrified to see that in chasing the higher interest rates, his savings portfolio was a who's who of where not to deposit your money. Only the Icelandic banks and a Ponzi scheme or two were missing from his list. But fortunately, I've been able to get him through that position, and the pensioners' bond will be right up his street. It's available from January 2015. It's going to pay 2.8% for money held for 1 year and 4% for 3-year bonds. So Mr. Osborne concluded by saying it was a budget for makers, doers and savers. And my opinion is that he's very much won the day. Response from the opposition was surprisingly muted, with neither of the two heads, Miliband or Balls, having a great deal to say in opposing the measures outlined. Alternatively, the budget's been praised by many business leaders. He also achieved some political gain. Now, having started with the hairdressing theme, I'll finish with one too. So in discussing the pension reforms, the editor of Economania, which is the Chartered Accountants magazine, said as follows: "The pension reform is either an inspired quantum shift in how the savings landscape operates, or it's a naked political ploy to give UKIP-friendly grey Middle England a blue rinse." Now, for a more detailed insight and their own observations, we're now going to hear from our very own commentators, our Senior Tax Manager, Anne Wilson, and then our Director of Taxation, Nadeem Hussain.